Thank you for joining us for this webinar on National STEAM Day 2021. We hope that it will provide some support to those who are seeking funding and trying to stay motivated, and as the saying goes, to just keep swimming. I'm Liz Jackson, the Senior Specialist for Research and Grants Program at the Foundation. The Foundation for Physical Therapy Research is projected to award 15 scholarships this year. We will discuss some of our opportunities as well as our projected grants after the presentation by our two guests. We also have transitioned to a new grants management platform and encourage you to stay on for that time. We may comment at any time on social media, and we can share your comments and follow. You may comment at any time on social media, and we can share your comments and follow up with your questions. To kick off our event, I would like to introduce our host, Clinical Assistant Professor at Baylor University, Doctor of Physical Therapy Program, Richard S. Severin. He will be joined by Professor and Associate VP for Clinical and Translational Research at the University of Delaware, Gregory Hicks.
All right. Welcome, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Hicks, for your time. And we got some great questions to kind of get into, and we're really excited to hear your expertise. So I guess we'll get started.
Sure. Right. Thanks for having me.
All right. So Dr. Hicks, so the first question, how do you mentor students to balance tension and kind of ease in their work?
Well, it's a huge challenge to maintain balance, if it's even possible. I think at best it's juggling. Sometimes you have to figure out, I had a professor told me a long time ago, you have to figure out which plates you're juggling, which ones can hit the ground and which ones can't. Some you have to keep in the air. I think we all have to realize that, tension and stress are unavoidable. And what we just have to do is to be prepared. We can't be surprised when that happens. To be prepared, I think there are a couple ways to prepare, really. One is to really plan things out as much as you possibly can. Plan out what your responsibilities are, what things you have to do. If we're talking about writing a grant application while you're doing other, work-related tasks, how do you fit that in? I use a calendar system. I put deadlines on my calendar. I write in chunks of writing time to make sure that I'm devoting the correct amount of time to it. That gives me some control, because we know in life, the uncontrollable happens all the time. And so as much as you can keep an even keel and have a stable base, then when things do happen, you've got some wiggle room. In the geriatric and gerontologic literature, we talk about concepts of frailty and resilience. And frailty is really a state of having inadequate physiologic reserve to deal with stressors as they arise. Whereas resilience is the exact opposite. It means that you do have a reserve available. And that's what you want to try to do through planning, is to make sure that you have enough reserves available. I think the other thing is to really try to know yourself as best as you can and what works for you. In terms of managing stress, it's different for everyone. Some it's exercise, some it's talking to the right person. Maybe it's praying, meditating. You have to figure out what works for you and stick to those things. So it's all about preparation, if you ask me.
Yeah, so the plan, it's a big part. I think you kind of got into the second question we had lined up for you. So I'll move on to the next one. Okay. What are the factors apart from the strength of a funding application that may affect whether or not funding is awarded, just in your experience, in your opinion?
So outside of the funding application itself, I think there are a few things that are not necessarily within the applicant's control. Available funding, how many dollars are actually available through the funding agency, the alignment of your project with the mission and goals of the funder. You could have a great application, but if you're really not in alignment with where they're going, that may be a reason that you wouldn't get funded. The strength and the numbers of competitive applications that come in during that review cycle, that also can shift things in a different way. And then, the other thing that you really have no control over is the interests and perspectives and biases that the reviewers bring to the table when they review a grant, right? You can't control that part. The best you can do is to try to make sure that you're laying out as sound of an argument as possible and have things be as objective as possible, so that you don't run into too many issues. But there, you don't have that much control, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And most foundations, just in my experience, the foundation, of course, being one of those foundations, will give you a list of kind of the mission and where they're going. Because you're right. You can have a very strong application, but if you're not speaking the same kind of language, it's just not gonna work. Right.
Right. You have to know what people are excited about, what's in their portfolio, what do they want to add to, what maybe they're starting to think, oh, we have enough work in this area. So staying abreast of those things, I think, is really helpful.
Yeah. Would you say, in addition to looking at the mission, that maybe like looking at what they funded before might be a good idea too?
That can definitely be helpful to get a sense of where things are and maybe where they're going. But you're right. Most organizations will typically give you a good sense of what's at play and what things they're excited to see come through the door. So if you stick to that, you should be in pretty good shape there.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the next question I have is one that I think is kind of the theme really for this interview here and for this webinar is, how do you receive feedback on rejected funding applications? That process of going through even negative, or not negative feedback, but critical feedback of your funding.
So ask that again for me. I just want to make sure.
Yeah. So the question we have was, how can one receive feedback on a rejected funding application?
Okay, on a rejected funding application. So, every application, you're going to get some sort of feedback in some form, right? Typically, it's going to be written feedback, depending on the funding agency. With NIH, which is where I'm most familiar, or the Foundation for PT Research, or NSF, or VA, you're going to have a panel of expert reviewers. Typically, it's going to be 3, maybe 4 reviewers who review your application, and they're going to give written feedback. Then scientific staff in the funding organization are going to make determinations based upon preliminary scores about which applications get triaged. So triaging is about which applications will get discussed, which ones will not get discussed. Regardless of whether they're discussed or not, you're going to have the written feedback from those individual reviews. The added benefit, if it's discussed, is that there's that discussion that happens in person, where hopefully the reviewers start to coalesce around these are the main issues that are score driving. Then typically you get a summary statement that would give a summary of that discussion of what those main points were. Obviously, if you get that level of feedback, it's more helpful, but you're going to have written feedback either way. It's a lot like what would happen with a manuscript coming back. You're going to have the written feedback. Your job then, as the applicant, once you get past whatever feelings you might have about the review, right, is to really dissect the comments. Take your time, go through the comment, have people that you trust really look at those comments with you. I typically would go through and I actually write out each single comment from a reviewer and try to figure out what is it that they're really trying to get across to me. Then I want to look for whether or not I see similar things in each of the reviews that come through. That starts to help me figure out what directions I need to go. And, one of the things I always tell my students and my trainees is, eat the fish and leave the bones. And so you've got to realize that all feedback is good. All feedback does make you better, even if it doesn't necessarily feel so good in the moment. But it's about taking the time to really try to figure out, even though the words might be cutting, what are they really trying to say? And what should I take away from that?
Absolutely. And you brought up a good point in your discussion on this question about having maybe a third party, another person reviewing it, because I think we talked about in the lead up to this about sometimes you can read too much into it, and maybe you're taking the feedback in a completely different direction than where they're going. Could you speak a little bit about that? That, like, having that, like, making sure you're realizing what the feedback's actually telling you.
Yeah, I think it's human nature to sort of we get stuck in our own heads, right? And so we have our own preconceived notions about what people are saying. And sometimes you read through it and you might be glossing over what they're really saying. And I've had this experience with myself. I've also had this experience recently with some junior faculty and students that I've worked with, where they were sort of upset about whatever the feedback was. and almost dismissing something because it did sound a little bit like, there's not really a point to that. And when you start to really look at it, I pushed and I said, look, I think maybe this is what they're saying. And all of a sudden it opened up this new door where all of us realized, oh gosh, we had not even explained this point. And so it's that you have to be open, right? You can't just assume I know best. I don't really have to listen to other people. I think it's like, I always try to get my trainees to realize all feedback is really valuable and important, because even if it's feedback that you disagree with, it's important to understand different people's perspectives because they're not the only person who thinks that way. So that means you're going to have to combat that same way of thinking with multiple people. So either way, you've got to figure it out and try to understand how to really handle it and respond to it appropriately. Absolutely. So it's taking the time, you know?
Absolutely. And I think it speaks to the value of having a great mentor. Right? I've been in that situation myself before. You're like, man, they don't know what they're talking about. And you have that, someone who's kind of been through the ringer before, kind of like, well, take a step back. This is kind of what they're saying. This is actually really useful feedback. So
right.
Absolutely.
Look, the first paper that I ever submitted, it got rejected, and the feedback, I put it in the drawer. I never even resubmitted the paper. I was so frustrated. And as time went on, maybe it would take a few days. Now I'm sort of like, whatever, it is what it is, and just try to figure out what are they saying. But that comes with time too. Yeah. But realizing that there usually is something good to be taken away from it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So we'll move on to the next questions here. So what advice would you offer to mentors in helping them guide their mentees through the application process? Kind of similar to some of the things we've been talking about before.
Right. I think one of the things that I've really learned over the years in working with mentees is I used to feel like as the mentor, I had to drive everything, that I had to be responsible for each meeting and what the agenda was for that meeting. And at some point, and I don't really know what sort of rung the bell for me, but I started to realize I think I'm making a mistake by approaching things this way. So I have really had a wholesale shift in how I mentor students or trainees of any sort. I think it should be their responsibility to really drive those regular meetings that we have. So I will ask them to set the agenda for the meeting. They will discuss what the deliverables are, what the action items should be. They're responsible for the minutes from the meeting, and then the charge moving forward. So I think it's really important as a first step to do that with mentees so that they start to really hold responsibility for this work that they're doing. The next thing in terms of getting an application out is really going through and reviewing all the application components. Because I think, again, we sometimes make the assumption based upon our present experiences that anyone can read a document and they should be able to figure it out. But sometimes there's, sort of that invisible curriculum that's at play. And so I think taking that time to go through the application, what the components are, what maybe are the best strategies to take, what's the best order, go through that process with the trainee. If you have examples to provide, I think that's always helpful. For someone, the first time they write a specific aims page for a grant, that's always daunting. And I think that's one of the most important things that you do in grant writing is that specific aims page. But if someone doesn't know what that should look like or don't have examples, it makes it challenging. So I think if you can bring examples to bear, I think that's always a huge, huge help for trainees. And then working with them to set due dates.
Yeah. Right?
I do not like last minute. That just doesn't work so well for me. And I don't think it should work well for anyone. And so I always want to have enough time so that there's enough time for them to have multiple rounds of reviews from different people, right? Not just from me. And then I think the other part is helping them identify people who would be good for them to have review their proposal as they get feedback along the way. To me, those are probably the big things that I would focus on.
Yeah, yeah, and I think what your experience and expertise kind of speak to some of my experiences as a PhD student myself. That I've really valued having a mentor where a lot more accountability is kind of placed on. And it's different mentorship approaches, but I think you can probably speak to this. That the more and it's a graduated, I think, independence that you're given, but like the more opportunities you have to kind of direct your own trajectory as a researcher, the better it's going to serve you later on. Because like once you're faculty and in a maybe a 10-year track, like you're kind of be expected to do this, right? So you kind of need to cut the training wheels in a certain sense.
Right. It's all about self-efficacy, right?
Yeah.
And so I could run my lab and have every trainee in my lab, tell them what to do. These are the things you need to achieve. You need to do X, Y, and Z. Then when they leave, do they know how to do any of those things for themselves? And I think that's a big part of what that training relationship should be about, is teaching them how to think as an independent scientist, and also how to handle the operations of the lab and all the things that need to happen. I sometimes see investigators who struggle with recruitment of participants. And when I talk to them, I find out that often in their PhD training, there were, patients or participants who were already recruited because they were part of a mentor study. So they actually never went through that process of doing it. It's the same for anything, right? You have to gain self-efficacy in doing something before you really feel confident that you can move forward and do it. And so I think the more that the mentor can help the trainee achieve that self-efficacy, I think the better.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think it speaks to the value of having a strong mentor, right? And making sure things click. And you're a perfect example of that, Dr. Hicks. So, the next question I have is kind of related to some of the things we talked about before regarding feedback, but it's kind of the age-old question, and I think everyone faces this dilemma when they first get feedback from anything. Is like, how do you know if your grant writing skills are just really bad, or if you should try to resubmit again?
To be honest, I think it's probably a little late to ask whether your grant writing skills are bad after you've gotten a bad review. I think that's a question you should be asking yourself pretty early on, and get a good sense of what your struggles are and what your strengths are. Because you only get one chance to make a first impression, right? And I've seen people have perspectives on someone because, I saw this from them and that just wasn't good. And then they can sort of get locked in this box for people. And you don't want to be in that space. Mm-hmm. So I think really, look, writing, it's the lifeblood of what we do as researchers. So it's something that right out of the gates, you should be working on with your mentor to make sure that your skill set is where it needs to be. But regardless of when you find out, you just got to keep going after it. You can't give up. If you don't submit the application, it's never going to get funded, right? Sure. So you have to put yourself out there. You just want to make sure that you're preparing well enough and give yourself enough lead time so that you can do everything possible to know that you put the best product out that you possibly could. I've seen too often people sort of rush to get something in, and they know that it's not even where they would like it to be. I think that's a bad situation to put yourself in.
Absolutely. It seems, a reoccurring theme is just preparation and doing the work, something that we do often. I don't think a lot of people realize that even before a paper is submitted, and you could tell as a reviewer sometimes whether something was rushed or went through what we call an internal review. You have someone, everyone on the paper or everyone on the grant looks at it, gives feedback, and it's gone through multiple iterations. Because you're right, like your work kind of is your calling card, and if it's not good, people may view it that way for a while.
Right. Yeah. And then it's hard to dig out of that hole. Right now I'm a PI for a large infrastructure grant, NIH infrastructure grant, and the application is due in October of 22. we have already started the writing process. We've spent the past 6 months doing strategic planning, and our first deadline for specific aims pages for each of the cores within is this Friday.
Yeah.
And so our goal is to have first drafts completely done in January, February timeframe, so that we've got enough time to get it out to reviewers. So you want to be able to give yourself time to do that. You don't need that much time for a single application, but the idea is still the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Preparation. I can't remember the famous quote. I think it was like preparing properly or something like that, or peak performance. But either way, preparation is crucial. And that goes back to what you talked about early on as a trainee, or as a PhD student, getting them in the habit of setting those schedules and giving yourself enough time, because you need to be able to do that all throughout your career, really.
Absolutely.
So the last question that I have for you is, how do you go about improving your grant writing skills, maybe after a rejection or just in general?
Yeah, I think with writing, it's practice. There are people who you really need to have focused time to just work on your writing. With my trainees, the first thing they do is I have them use data that I have existing to start to write a paper.
Awesome.
Not that it's going to be anything that's their dissertation, but it's about them learning the writing process. And so I invest heavily in the beginning with the expectation that they're going to start to pull it together and get it together, because it is different. Writing for, manuscript writing is different than grant writing. Mm-hmm. Those are two different skill sets that you have to learn, but it's all about clarity.
Yep.
And, identifying those reviewers who are really important for you. For me, my entire time, I spent most of my career here at the University of Delaware, and Darcy Reisman, who is the chair of our department now, she's a stroke researcher. She is my go-to person for looking at my specific aims page or my grants. Mm-hmm. I do the same thing for her. I study low back pain in older adults. Our work is not really similar.
Yeah.
But having that person who can look at it and doesn't have the sort of same lens that you do is really valuable. I often will tell my students, have your boyfriend, girlfriend, your mom or dad read it. And if it makes sense to them and you sold the argument to them, that's a really good sign.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be so complicated. And I think sometimes we think scientific writing should be complex and sound complicated. You've got to simplify. That's the biggest thing to me.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Hicks, thank you for sharing your expertise and your perspective here. I think the lessons taught here were immeasurably valuable, and thank you again for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Having this conversation, it's such an important conversation to have. We wanted to tell you a little bit about the foundation and our mechanisms. As you know, we have a PODS 1 and 2. Those are promotion of doctoral studies scholarships. And then we have a combined PODS 2/NIFTY, what we awarded last year. And then we have a NIFTY fellowship that will not be offered this year, because our NIFTY applicant, we hope, will be moving forward. And then we have research grants. The eligible applicants for each one of these mechanisms fall into these categories: pre-candidacy PhD students, PhD candidates, postdoctoral fellows, emerging investigators, and experienced investigators. We have a number of grant opportunities for 2022. Be sure to check back to our website, but we have the Magistro Family Foundation Research Grant available for 2022, and a note there that a LOI stands for a letter of intent is required. Same thing with the Paris Patla Physical Therapy Research Grant. Also, a letter of intent is required for those grants. There's also a General Foundation Research Grant, which is $40,000 to emerging investigators. And that is to conduct research that's consistent with the current APTA research agenda. And then we also have an education research grant, which is a $40,000 research grant that's awarded to an emerging investigator for education research related to methods for promoting the uptake of research findings into education. More specifically, the purpose of this grant mechanism is to design educational interventions to address the gap between evidence and practice. Then we have a Paris Patlum manual therapy research grant. A research grant will be awarded for research related to orthopedic manual therapy. Details surrounding this award for 2022 are on the horizon. Please check the website for more information as it becomes available. We are also offering a Snyder research grant. It's a $40,000 research grant to be awarded to support relevant clinical research projects aimed to investigate A, those services delivered by physical therapists, and B, the development of new interventions that offer reasonable assurance that they will be clinically relevant and therapeutically effective. This grant is generously supported through the Snyder Endowment Fund. And I spoke to the education research grant on the previous page. In 2022, the foundation will accept applications for the pods 1 and 2. We've already started accepting those applications, and we hope to give out about 15 awards in 2022. Again, please visit our website. And please note, we will not collect a NIFTY fellowship application this round. So we have a new platform that we're using. It's called Proposal Central. It's fairly straightforward. However, if you encounter any issues, please feel free to connect with me or foundation staff. Or even Proposal Central's IT support is willing to help answer questions if you have trouble in submitting your application. All inquiries to the foundation can be sent to info@foundationforpt.org, and we will get your questions answered. What are reviewers looking for? Clear and concise project descriptions. They follow the submission guidelines and instructions, the criteria. The likelihood for the project to exert a difference on the research fields involved. We have sample successful applications that we're willing to share with you. People that have been successful in the past have just agreed to pay it forward to our applicants. And so if you want something like that, please contact us at info@foundationforpt.org. And again, I can't say it enough. Visit foundationforpt.org for more information. Be sure to click subscribe to our mailing list, our YouTube channel, and/or follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter for up-to-date information on the foundation.